wanted to welcome you all to kind of the first time that we're doing this. We've got a pretty big group that RSVP'd. We're going to be recording this and sharing this out afterwards. So I hope that the reach for this is pretty large. And to those of you who couldn't join us live, welcome. We've got people that are viewing this from all over the world, a lot of different titles and roles, as you've seen in the poll that we've been conducting as people are joining. And like I said, this is kind of the first time that we put something like this together, specifically focused on design prototyping and how that kind of fits into, you know, the greater scheme of, like, you know, the different roles that we've defined in our industry. We had hoped initially to do something more in person, more interactive, get a bunch of folks together for like a knowledge share and a day of just kind of like really picking each other's brains about what's working, what's not, where we're headed as a role or as a discipline. But because of COVID, we've had to change our plans a little bit. And one of the upsides to that actually is we get to include a lot more people in this discussion. And so that's one of the things that I'm really looking forward to is kind of getting this started. And hopefully, while we'll be hearing from Doug and Spotify today, we could expand this and hear from more of you and your teams in the coming weeks, months, and hopefully at some point get back together in person. I wanted to just talk a little bit about Doug, who we're going to hear from in just a few minutes. I met him last spring, actually, when he and his team were on kind of like a fact-finding knowledge share mission out in the Bay Area. He's got a team that's all over, you know, based all over the country or all over the world, actually. And so they were kind of coming out here to learn about what folks are doing at different companies when it comes to prototyping. And so we got together, and I think like we had a great discussion about what they're finding and what they're learning. And there was a real desire to kind of continue the momentum that they had built on this trip and then share that information out with the greater community and sort of build some more community around that idea, actually. One of the things I think that we definitely connected with and had in common, and that it seems like is reflected in the polling that we asked when people joined, is that it's hard to bucket us into a really clear role. When you're kind of a hybrid of a bunch of different skills and you like prototyping and do that as part of your career, but in addition to that technical side, you also have an appreciation for the visual and for the design and for the product thinking. How does that kind of fit into like what we pretty much have as an industry, very specific tracks, career tracks for designers and very specific career tracks for engineers, but there's this kind of blended space in between where a lot of us live. And that's, I think, the thing that we have most in common. And so I'm excited for Doug in just a second to share his story. Doug, if you don't know, or if you haven't seen him on LinkedIn, is a design prototyping manager at Spotify. He basically formalized the role of UX prototyper early on. So he worked with management to do this. And he's also done the hands-on work. So he's had some time to actually get his hands dirty, do the work of prototyping as well at Spotify. And today he leads a small prototyping team that I mentioned earlier. They're a super talented group of folks who are pretty senior and have a lot of great experience, and they're dispersed all over the world. So Doug, I'm going to toss it to you. I'm going to let you kind of take it from here, and we'll come back for a Q&A in the last couple of minutes. As I kind of mentioned on the slide to begin, there is an open Q&A. So if you have any questions that you want to ask, or, you know, we'll be kind of taking those throughout the presentation. And then we'll leave some time at the end to kind of filter through and make sure we get a chance to have some of that discussion. So thanks again for joining us. Thanks for making the time in your day. And Doug, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. Let me just share my screen here. Cool. All right. Can you guys all see that? All right. Perfect. Okay. Cool. So hello, everyone. I'm Doug DeMarco, and I manage the design prototyping team at Spotify, based in New York. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my design prototyping journey. And before I get into that, I just wanted to actually give a big thank you to Steve Saul from Facebook for his help putting all this together. He mentioned this, but, you know, we had this really exciting kind of in-person event planned that Facebook was going to host. And, well, you know, the world clearly had other plans. So we couldn't make it happen this year, but hopefully in the future, we can all get together and meet and share and network in person. And I also wanted to give a shout out to JC Ely and Nufal Kadam at Netflix, Tony Topper at Walmart, and Paul Armstrong at Facebook for helping us make this like shift to an online format, while we're all in this kind of stay-at-home world right now. And of course, most importantly, I want to thank all of you guys for tuning in and joining our LinkedIn group and connecting and just kind of, just being a part of this. I'm not sure I need to call it out, but there is a ton of talent on this call. And I think we've got folks here from Netflix, Walmart, Google, Airbnb, Facebook, my team from Spotify, just to name a few. And it looks like there's also some people from some smaller shops and some startups as well, which is great. So it's really inspiring for me to see this event become a reality. And, it's also incredibly humbling to be speaking to a crowd of this caliber. So here goes. Okay, cool. So I wanted to begin by telling you a little bit about my story and how I got my start and sort of discovered prototyping. Maybe it's even similar to some of your stories. And then I wanted to tell you about the design prototyping team at Spotify, explain our mission and how we work, the tools we use, things like that. And then I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some of the misconceptions surrounding prototyping. These are a handful of things that I've kind of encountered along the way and reflected on a bit. And maybe you've encountered some of them as well. And after all of that, we should have a bunch of time left for some Q&A. All right, so this is my story, and we'll take you right to the beginning. So I got my start way back in the dark ages of the internet. I graduated from college with a degree in graphic communications and a concentration in illustration. I originally wanted to draw comic books for a living, and I spent like months just sending in artwork samples to Marvel and DC, hoping to get any kind of work that they might have for me. And I had absolutely no success whatsoever doing that. And eventually I had this kind of like difficult moment of realization where I was like, I have no experience. I have, no fancy internships on my resume. My money's running out. I'm clearly not going to be the next penciler for Spider-Man. And I'm living above my sister's garage and just kind of, feeling like a loser. So I was like, I really need to look into another line of work. So I took stock of what I did have, which was all of the basic design software skills at the time. So, Photoshop, Illustrator, Macromedia Director, if anyone out there remembers that one. And then, and I thought, well, maybe I can learn how to make websites. So I went down to Barnes & Noble, as you did, and I bought a book on HTML, this book, in fact. And 3 weeks later, I got a job building websites. Now, again, this was 1999, and you could actually get away with that kind of thing back then. For reference, this is before CSS, if you can get your head around that, right? We're building things with like table layouts and font tags. Anyway, so I got this job, and I more or less had no idea what I was doing. But luckily for me, at the time, really neither did anyone else. And once I was on the job, I spent most of my time trying to learn as much as I possibly could about building websites. So JavaScript, CSS, eventually, Flash, ASP, PHP, anything that I thought might help me make cool things on the internet. Now, full disclosure, there was a little more behind my transition from art major to a career in tech. I learned how to program when I was 8. And by the time I was 14, I was building computer games in a language called GW Basic, which is not, Java. It's not super sophisticated, but it's, it's got the basics. And this is an almost 30-year-old dot matrix printout of a basketball strategy game that I wrote when I was 14. It is the worst spaghetti code you've ever seen, but it was actually a lot of fun to play. So growing up, I had these like deep interest in tech and computers and like the math and science side of academics, but also in art and design. And so heading into college, I thought architecture was going to be that like sweet spot for me, but at the last minute, I decided against it and just kind of went for illustration. All right, so the company I had gotten this job with was a small marketing company in Connecticut that maintained Accenture's corporate website. So for any of you who might not know, Accenture is one of the world's largest consulting firms, and they love to talk about themselves. So it was a really big website even back then. So I got the chance to do some fairly high profile work, and eventually I led both the design and development of the Accenture.com homepage during their 2003 and 2005 redesigns. And yes, this homepage was done in Flash. It was 2005. Like, what else would I do it in, right? And I'm actually going to go ahead and say this. I actually kind of miss Flash. I'm not saying that we should bring it back necessarily, but I don't know. I just felt like it was such a great all-in-one development environment, and you could like design and code all in one place. It's kind of a prototyper's dream. All right, so here I am, a web designer. You know, I love what I do. I'm like feeling so lucky to have this job that lets me be, you know, creative and use design thinking, but then also get my hands dirty and like be technical and actually build the things that we're drawing up and like pull from all the interests that I had when I was younger. And I just really felt like I had found my calling and I was at peak professional satisfaction, but that would not last too much longer. So my next job was at a place called Vibrant Media in New York City, and they did online advertising, and their flagship product was this thing called in-text advertising. So for those of you who might not remember this, if you were on a website reading an article, you'd see words that would have these double green underlines, and if you moused over them, an ad would appear that was somehow related to the word that you moused over. So if the word was luggage, you might get an ad for Tumi or Samsonite or something like that. It was kind of creative, kind of annoying, and this is what it looked like back in 2005 when I first started. It sort of has that like operating system tooltip vibe. And shout out to Greg Campaverde, who I think is on the call today, as well as any other ex-Vibrant folk who might be tuning in. All right, so shortly after I started working there, I took a stab at reimagining what their in-text ad product experience could be. So I built this demo where the ad vessel looked more modern and it, you know, had lots of flash and video in it, and it was intentionally a little over the top, but it got people there like really excited about what these ads could potentially look like. And a few months later, we launched a product called Vibrant Video. So my claim to fame is that I designed and built the internet's first in-text video advertisement. Yeah, kind of cool. But what was really cool was that this was my first true prototype. And Vibrant was a great place to work for a while. You know, we had some pretty big clients advertising with us, like Microsoft here. But eventually I was ready for the next step, and I started looking for a new job. Now, for my whole career so far, I'd always had this like very hands-on role, you know, doing both design and front-end development. So I'm out there job hunting, and this is like circa 2009, 2010. And my biggest takeaway from that search was that no one knew what to do with a designer-developer hybrid. You know, in interviews, I would get a lot of like, well, if you had to choose design or front-end development, which would you choose? And I was always like, well, neither. You know, it's the space between where I feel like my value, you know, truly shines. And everyone hated that answer. So I felt a little like this. You know, the tech industry at this point was definitely maturing, and there were now very specific established job roles and departments and like kind of like playbooks on how you did things. And there was nothing about unicorns in those playbooks. And I think what I love most about the industry when I first started is that there were no playbooks, right? It was like the Wild West. It was exciting, and we were all just, you know, figuring it out as we went along. Anyway, so after a long period of not finding the job I wanted, I thought to myself, well, if I can't find the right job, then I'm just going to create it. And so I quit, and I started my own freelance business, and then I felt more like this guy. And it took a while to get going, but once it did, things went pretty well. And I'm happy to dive further into my decision to do this during Q&A for anyone out there who might also be frustrated with like a world that doesn't always believe in unicorns and is, you know, thinking about doing something similar. But I will say a few things. One, freelancing was something that I had always wanted to do, or at least for a long time. And I didn't know if I wanted to do it forever, but I felt like I needed to try it at some point. And two, I was financially able to do this. I had saved up some money, and I was prepared to make like $0 for a full year before giving up. And incidentally, that came very close to actually happening. So in some ways I was ready, but in pretty much every other way, I was just woefully unprepared looking back on it now. But ultimately I wouldn't have done it any differently. You know, you're never going to be fully ready to make a big change like that. And, you know, sometimes you need to just kind of put yourself in that sink or swim situation and force yourself to hustle and work hard and kind of figure things out and see where it takes you. It also helped me understand the importance of networking. Building a network, like you all are kind of doing right now by being part of this, is one of the most important things that you can do. Almost every freelance project I got during that time came directly from my network. All right, so I'm freelancing, I'm designing, I'm building, you know, my own boss. I could do things, you know, however I wanted to. And all that mattered was delivering something that my client was happy with. So I took on a nice mix of projects, you know, lots of landing pages and emailers to kind of keep the lights on, but also full websites and API-driven advertisements, and of course, design prototypes. And in 2013, my network showed me just how valuable it could be. A guy I used to work with at Vibrant reached out to me about doing some freelancing at Spotify. And he was starting up the ad product team there and needed some help building proof of concept prototypes. So a few small projects here and there turned into larger, more regular projects. And eventually I was working there on site pretty much every day. So in November of 2014, we made it official, and I took on a full-time position at Spotify as a senior UX developer. And my job was focused around building prototypes for the ad product team. And so prototyping became my answer for how I could continue to both design and develop at a relatively large company. And it also helped me realize that I didn't need or even really want to be this like one-man show doing all the design and all the development work. I could instead just focus on the parts that I enjoyed most, which were coming up with an idea and then making that idea something tangible, something that worked, but not worrying about things like optimizing code or complex build infrastructures or like a lot of the kind of production concerns that engineers spend a lot of time with. So I had some success with the ad product team at Spotify for a while, but it seemed like there might be other teams across Spotify that could benefit from the kind of work that I was doing. So about 2.5 years ago, we formed the design prototyping team. And we are a small group of designer developers who specialize in bringing design concepts to life. And this is actually a photo of us visiting Facebook's San Francisco office where I met Steve last year. And our team's mission is to partner with teams across Spotify to deliver high fidelity prototypes, to support the prototyping efforts of the embedded designers, and provide toolkits and documentation that make prototyping easier and faster. So our work is really balanced between sort of service-oriented projects where we partner with a team, get up to speed on the problem they're trying to solve, maybe help them with design direction, and ultimately we deliver a high fidelity prototype that might pull in personalized data, do audio and video playback, maybe voice recognition or speech synthesis or things like that. And so you can think of this as us giving people a fish, versus teaching people how to fish, which would be our more support-oriented projects where we build reusable toolkits for the purposes of prototyping, run training sessions or create documentation on how to use tools like Framer X, build plugins for Figma, or make utilities that allow designers to access content from Spotify's web API or some other data source. So things that sort of up-level everyone's prototyping capabilities. And in terms of how we build our prototypes and what tools we use, I thought I would mention a few. The Spotify web API. So this isn't really a tool in the traditional sense, but it lives at the heart of pretty much all of our prototypes. And it's a public API, so the documentation and support is pretty good. And this API lets us do all sorts of cool things with our prototypes, like allow users to sign in and access their personalized listening data and save playlists, access Spotify music library content like album and artist artwork and updated playlist tracks, and of course do full playback control of music and podcasts on behalf of a user. So it's a pretty powerful tool that helps us build really immersive prototypes that are often hard to differentiate from the real app. React Native. So we've spent the last few years building out a robust React Native toolkit that recreates most of Spotify's mobile UI, and it enables us to build prototypes that run as native apps on the iPhone, while allowing us to alter them using the web technologies like JavaScript, React, that our team is most familiar with. And these prototypes are incredibly high fidelity, easy to distribute, and they have look-back integration, so they're great for user testing. We also have a Framer X toolkit, which is primarily aimed at our embedded designers. And our goal with the Framer X toolkit is to allow even non-technical designers to build complex prototypes that pull in personalized information from our web API. So, and to do this simply by dragging and dropping components and like adjusting property values, no code required. And shout out to any folks from Framer if you're tuning in with us today. Congrats on the recent release of Framer for Web, the much anticipated. All right, so switching gears a little bit. These are some of my hot takes on a few things I've encountered along the way. I would classify as kind of misunderstandings about prototyping. And maybe you've heard some of these stories before and have your own related thoughts or stories. If you do, keep them handy because I feel like they could be pretty good fuel for the Q&A discussion that we'll get into next. Can we reuse your prototype code in production? So this is a fair enough question, right? And in some cases, yes, might be the answer. Back in my in-text advertising days, a lot of those prototypes made most of their way into production, for better or for worse, especially the Flash stuff. But recently, I've been thinking that this question might actually be backwards, and we should be asking, can we use production code in our prototype and focus more on leveraging existing components, to get our prototype up and running quickly, rather than trying to use the design prototyping process to deliver an efficiency that it's really not meant to deliver. Also, show me an engineer that wants to use my quick and dirty prototype code in production, right? This guy does not look too happy. All right, next. Are you a hidden way for us to get engineering resources? So to be clear, I've never actually had anyone ask me this, but I mention it because sometimes the teams we work with don't always fully understand our role. And if a team is having trouble, getting simple things pushed to production, or if they need help with A/B or quant testing or something like that, they might think that we can help them out with that, which is fair enough. But as a rule of thumb, at least at Spotify, we don't touch production code. And I have this mental model that I like to use to explain the difference between the design prototyping and engineering roles. So imagine that we're making a car. The design prototyping team is building the concept car, and their deliverable is a prototype. And so maybe this prototype is built for the car show, so it looks great on the outside, but maybe it's not fully operational under the hood, or maybe it's built for aerodynamics testing or crash testing or for performance testing. No one is ever going to buy this car, but it's built to make sure the ideas work, for pitching the concept, or for various types of testing. Now, the engineering team is making the production car, and their deliverable is the car that you actually buy at the dealership. And they have to think about all sorts of things that kind of have nothing to do with the car itself or even the experience of driving it, right? They have to build the factory that assembles the car. They have to make or source the various parts of the car. They have to build and operate the robots that work on the assembly line. They have to, do quality assurance on the car when it rolls off the line. You have to figure out how to get the car from the factory to the dealership, things like that. So even though there's some skills overlap between prototyping and engineering, their missions and deliverables are very different. Why do we need a prototype? So I personally believe that the end result of the design process should almost always be a prototype. And just like in our car mental model, the prototype is our deliverable. So specifically, prototypes will help you do three main things. One, explore a design concept. So anytime I've ever designed something and then gone and built that thing, the design almost always changes while I'm building it, right? And sometimes quite a bit. And it's just like through the act of building your prototype and interacting with it, and you uncover flawed ideas and also stumble on new solutions, right? That you couldn't have accounted for until it was in that more like fully realized state. So prototypes help add that extra dimension to the design process. Two, get stakeholder buy-in. So sometimes you need more than just a slide deck to sell someone on your idea, right? And having a prototype that acts as a proof of concept makes it much easier for people to understand your idea. And I find these prototypes tend to be most effective when they are done in very high fidelity. So you want to give the stakeholder minimal prompting, just kind of put it in their hands, let them explore, and just kind of get it. And three, user testing. So you've come up with a theory. Now you build a prototype to test that theory by putting it in front of users and getting feedback. I know that none of this is new to anyone on this call, but I do find that it helps to keep these categories in mind as your primary reasons for prototyping, and for keeping them handy for educating people who might be new to prototyping or just not really get it. And if your project doesn't need to do any of these things for whatever reason, then yeah, maybe you don't need a prototype. Cool, and I'm actually gonna go ahead and stop right there and open up the Q&A. I'm gonna rely on Steve to feed me some questions here. But yeah, that was my journey and a little bit about my team at Spotify, and just some general musings about prototyping. So yeah, so let's, before I get to the questions, I have like my, feel free to write down my email and LinkedIn information and reach out if you have questions that maybe are a little bit more longer form, and if you just don't want to ask them in this forum. But yeah, thank you.
Cool, awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Doug. And that's great that you've got your stuff up there, your contact information. I definitely think like we've been sending out a link, and I'll send this out as a follow-up to folks that might want to join. But in the meantime, I think this is a great time to take some questions. So if you have some that you want to chat into the Q&A, feel free to pull that up at the bottom. There's a link to do it. You can chat those into us, and we'll kind of filter through as we go here. Doug, we do have one to start. It sounds like there's a lot of like high fidelity prototyping that you and your team are currently doing. Is there any part of the process where you guys make low fidelity prototypes, or you're focused on stuff that's more low fidelity?
Yeah, so we as a team tend to, that tends to be end up getting done a lot by the designers on the teams that we work with. So I would really love for us to do a little bit more of that stuff as well. Like if we were to kind of come in a little bit earlier in the process, but just the way that things work, sometimes we don't get in until they've kind of already done that phase. So we would love to do more of that, but it just tends to be that by the time we end up on a project, they've kind of done like the, you know, the principal prototypes or like kind of the basic stuff. And then we come in to pull in data or do kind of the higher fidelity stuff.
Got it. Yeah, I think, and like when I think about our prototyping process at Facebook, like we're very, like you guys have a very centralized, it sounds like, effort that at least is like been going. But and guys from you know, JC or Tony, if you guys want to chime in, like feel free to come on as well. But you know, like we have a very decentralized process where, you know, we span from very low fidelity stuff that's done in Sketch all the way up to like, we have a tool, Origami Studio, that actually allows us to work with our Facebook data and stuff and be like, you know, pretty high fidelity. So we have a lot of range of stuff that we work with as well. Okay, cool. I've got some other questions here that have been rolling in. What does career progression look like for you in this role? So like, you know, would being a freelance prototyper have close to giving you, would being a freelance prototyper have come close to giving you the lifestyle you get by being an employee at a big tech company?
I guess, I mean, in terms of, yeah, I think in terms of money, maybe, I think it's very different. They're different. Like for me, the things that were so great about freelancing were like the freedom and just like you were your own boss. Like the things that were great about freelancing were like the opposite of the things that were great at like being part of a company. You know, for me, it was a little bit lonely just kind of working on my own, and you know, you had to worry about everything. So you couldn't just sit and focus on just building or designing something. You had to like be always thinking about where your next project was going to come from, or you know, doing taxes or, you know, things like that. So they're very different in terms of kind of what you do, I think. And like I always felt like the things that were the best about freelancing were the things that like were the least great about having kind of like that steady job at a place like Spotify, and vice versa, if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely like some some extra stuff you have to do with your freelance work that is not glamorous and
Yeah.
doesn't help, but you do have the freedom to pursue, you know, kind of your interests. Being sort of, this is a great question, being sort of the middle person, can you elaborate more on the process and learnings you've had regarding collaboration between like researchers, product designers, and engineers?
Yeah. So gosh, I might need a refresher on that one as I answer this, but I always find that the more collaboration, the better. So like the earlier we can come into the process, and the more people who are involved earlier on, and people from different, like I love this sort of design workshop concept, right? Where you have people, you have maybe like a business person, or you have like a researcher or an engineer, and everyone's kind of coming together, and it has that equal seat at the table, and everyone's ideas matter equally. And then you're kind of collectively coming up with these things. Like, to me, that's the ideal way to do it. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I meandered a little bit there, but like, I think, yeah, the more collaboration with the more varied backgrounds and perspectives, I think the better. That's just going to make, I think, a better product or a better solution.
So like more specifically, like when you're working with like product designers, right? How does that kind of collaborative process look for you guys?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the best way to answer this. Again, it's a lot of like the earlier we can be brought in, the better, and kind of I think the more we know about the project before we get involved, the stronger our, the help that we can provide is going to be. And, just bringing us into that kind of workshop situation where we can help the ideas and kind of really understand the idea. Because I think a big problem that since we're centralized, we often come into these projects not knowing a whole lot of the background, right? And that's kind of good and bad, right? Like, so it's bad that we, everyone on the team probably has has a big head start on us in terms of like knowledge base for that specific thing, but we can kind of come in and be that like fresh pair of eyes. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think like when I think about it, Facebook, like how our team or my like squad currently works with our product designers, I like the assumption sometimes is that, oh, as a prototyper, you're going to come in and basically build my prototype for me, and they have this vision of what they want, and then like we're just kind of like just like they typically work with an engineer where they kind of like spec out the work and say like, let's get this done. They kind of sometimes have this preconceived notion that that's like kind of will work in the same way because it has that similar mental model that they're used to. So one of the tough things about what we kind of try to work with them on is building kind of an understanding around the difference in the process and how like we're really there to support them with the more advanced stage of the prototyping where it gets tricky when you're working with data, for example, or when we're really trying to stress test edge cases, things like that. And how that's a little bit different as a true partner where we start early on in the process and kind of like, we're going to push back with some of the ideas too. We're going to help you figure out like what's working about this design and what's not. And kind of really that collaborative relationship is a lot more emphasized and early on, as opposed to like a clean handoff of like, here's the specs we've got, now bring it to life, right?
Yeah, I would second that. I think it's really about, or at least what we want it to be, is we want it to be collaborative the whole way through and not feel like, I sometimes get that feeling. It's like, oh, does a designer think we're stepping on their toes by like coming in and like kind of wanting to help out at this point? This is, their idea. And it's not about that. It's about like, hey, we're going to build this cool thing together and you're going to bring in your talents and background and I'm going to do the same thing. And
yeah, so here's another kind of related question. Sometimes I struggle with quantifying or explaining the value of prototyping. Like it's hard to demonstrate the rework that you're removing from an engineering team by prototyping early on. So do you have a good way of tracking like the value that your team adds?
Yeah, that is like the $1 million question. And actually it's funny that you say that because that was when we went out to visit. Last fall, I took my team out to visit a bunch of teams, including, Facebook, and we met with like Netflix and Walmart and a few other places. And that was the question we asked everyone. And everyone was always like, oh God, yeah, like great question, but oh, I don't know. Yeah. So I don't know that I even have the best answer for it because we're actually still, we're kind of in the middle of working on that right now, actually at Spotify. But some of the things that surfaced, I don't know if Brooks is on from Facebook, but he gave some really good, some good thoughts on that. And I think he was saying that really it's so for a qualitative approach, you could kind of just poll the teams that you work with and really just talk to them, or maybe send out a survey if you want to formalize it, but really just kind of talk to them and like really dig at, hey, how did prototyping help you with this project as compared to say a project where they didn't help or you didn't build prototypes or things like that, and kind of like really dig into kind of that. And then if you want to go kind of more quant, to try to do things like measure the amount of, I don't know how you would really go about doing this, but measuring the amount of engineering hours saved, right, by building these prototypes, or even like kind of how many versions you made before you then went to production, right? Because it might seem like, oh, we spent a lot of time making these 5 different prototypes, but if you figured out what the right thing to build was before you sent it to production, then that was time well spent, right? And you didn't have to waste everyone's, all the engineers' time. So I don't know if that's my answer. How does that's good.
Yeah, I think like, so, like you're thinking about like, okay, how do we like kind of showcase the value of this? What kind of general deliverables do you give them? Like when you're doing that, like what's like the valuable thing that you hand off?
So I mean, a finished prototype, probably off a prototype that we can put into user testing that does all the things that, that we need to learn, right? So we have, you know, a test plan, and if the prototype that we built gives us all that information, and we kind of feel confident about like how that performed in those tests, then that's a win. If it's, you know, really for me, it's like bringing to life this idea. So like you can kind of have some animations and something on a screen, but it's not until you like really just put it in your hands and like bring that thing to life. So kind of having that thing to show people is so important, right? Because if you need to get buy-in, or you need somebody to kind of, you know, support that to get the project started, or whatever, without having that working example of the thing that you had in mind, you know, it's going to be kind of hard to get buy-in.
So there's like a couple of different like use cases, right, for building a prototype that you mentioned, like, you know, and I think you're talking about some of them. You just threw some of them in there right there.
Mm-hmm.
Would you talk about kind of like what are the use cases that you see most commonly? Like what percentage, I guess, if you were to assign a percentage to it, like what percentage are you doing for each of these? Like in what percentage is it used for user testing, for example, or, you know, to showcase to leadership?
Yeah, I would say they're probably, I would say, let's say 70, they end up being kind of more like, let's say 75% user testing and 25% kind of big idea, stakeholder buy-in type stuff. I would love for it to honestly kind of be the other way around, because to me, I think that it's just the more exciting stuff for us to work on. But yeah, that's just kind of how it tends to break down, I think, for us.
There's a question in here that I think I definitely want to get to, and that's that somebody mentions that non-technical prototypers is mentioned earlier, and of course having dev experience, because it sounds like, you know, you have this background in you know, kind of early coding from your dot matrix days, which is super cool. So, you know, like dev experience is super valuable as a tool. But do all design engineers code in the day-to-day from kind of what you experienced, or like what you were out there learning in your kind of like knowledge share tour?
Yeah, cool. And I'll take that first, and then I'll hand that back over to you, Steve, and or JC,
Sure.
or anyone else who wants to kind of chime in on that. Yeah, I have found that is the case, that there's at least some kind of program. There's some, even if it's just basic JavaScript and HTML and CSS or something, there's typically some sort of level of technical kind of programming capability that they have, that I've found. I think that just because you don't always, like, a tool might serve you well, that it can kind of make some, you know, something like a principle will take you, you can make some really cool prototypes with that, but then you start getting to this point where like you have this, like, you know, 1 gig sized file, and it's got like 1 million screens, and it's just like, it's just a mess, and it's stuff that you probably could have done in, like, you know, you spent like, you know, months working on this thing, but you probably could have done it in like a few days if you had used, say, programming. So I think, yeah, for the most part, that I've found that most of these prototypers, design engineers, have that prototyping or the programming background or skill set. Yeah.
I think, yeah. So when I think about like the role specifically that I'm trying to fill, or, you know, that I try to add value at our organization, I think like the code part for us isn't, I don't think, as necessary. And I think that like what's important about it in my mind, when I kind of try to conceptualize like the vision of like a, you know, prototypical design engineer in my brain, is like somebody who just really is enjoying like learning about the different tools that are out there. And some of them might be code based, right? Like, I mean, like JavaScript or React is like a great toolkit if you use it that way. And like engineers don't necessarily see React as a design tool. They see it obviously as their production tool. And so like they think of that differently. But I think like there are so many, and you called them out in your presentation too, like Framer, or, you know, like the other different ones, like they just came out with a version of that for the web. Like there are so many tools that for the non-technical person enable you to have kind of these technical abilities, that like that's a really cool space that I think is like rapidly growing. And so like, while maybe a couple years ago, like in order to build something truly high fidelity and performant, like you had to go to the code to do it, I think they've added like so many cool tools that are out there. Maybe some that we, you know, haven't even tried yet. There's a ton that I'm like, you know, itching to get my hands on too and get into. But yeah, I like Flutter, for example, is something that I haven't ever tried, but I'm curious about. So you know, I think like there's a big opening for that.
That's great. Great answer, Steve.
I think like, let's see, regarding the backward idea of using production code and prototypes, like, So do you guys do this at Spotify? Like, are you guys basically using production code? Is this compatible with React prototype? Like, what's the compatibility there?
Yeah, so in some cases, so for our Framer X toolkit, we actually do just bring, so we have a lot of, for example, our Spotify for Artists website, it's a lot of web-based stuff, all that, it's all React under the hood. So we have like our design language that a lot of it is React. So not like the iOS app, but for a lot of the other things, it's all React-based. So we can just kind of bring that into our Framer X toolkit pretty easily. So that is essentially, we're using production code in that toolkit. With the React Native stuff, we do have to do a level of kind of recreating for some of it, but that's all React under the hood too. So yeah, so we do actually do that. Yeah.
What is your team's relationship with like the Spotify design system then? So like, how do you guys keep your tooling updated? How do you guys keep like do you guys have a team that you work with regularly?
Yeah, so we're actually part of the same kind of larger team, and we sit right next to them. So we have kind of like, yeah, pretty close relationship with them for sure. And yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. Okay. So you're basically you guys are kind of embedded with the design tools.
Yeah, we're like sister teams, I guess you would say. Like we sit next to each other, and we have a close relationship with them. We work with them on projects, and ensure that kind of things are up to date, and that we're pulling the right things, and we're using their tokens and all that kind of thing.
Got it. So when you guys are talking about like, really building something that's high fidelity, and you outlined earlier, like that use case about like, okay, in user testing or user research, how much personalization goes into those? Like, are you actually like showing real production data in those prototypes to people in user research and like showing them, music titles and things like that? Or how does that kind of work?
So, it depends on the project, but yeah, definitely. We try to always have some level of personalization when it makes sense, right? Or if it's possible. But typically, we like to show, like if we have a prototype that has somebody scrolling through some playlists and then playing some music, we'd like to have those playlists be things that user would be listening to, maybe even their own playlists. Because I actually remember a time when we did a prototype, and I remember this in user testing, and it was for an ad product, and the prototype kind of had you pick a playlist or listen to some tracks, and then eventually you'd get the ad, and we really just cared about the ad experience and not what was before it. But to save time, we didn't personalize it, and so we just had like today's top hits was the music, and so this one user was listening to the song, and it was Justin Bieber song, and he couldn't get past the fact that it was Justin Bieber, and every time we'd ask him a question, he's like, oh, I hate Justin Bieber, and it was just he was just useless because he could not get past the fact that he had to listen to the song. So had we kind of spent a little extra time making that a little bit more personalized and had his music, or at least given him a choice of music that he would want to listen to, then it might have gone a little bit better. But
so the only research finding from that session sounds like the guy doesn't like Justin Bieber.
Well, for that, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see that when people get super stuck on a part that you're not even that's the most unexpected part I think that I realized after sitting through some of our research sessions in person. I was blown away by how, in the absence of real seeing real data or seeing a real authentic thing in front of them, people get very focused on something that oh, well, this isn't my picture, or this isn't something that I would be a part of or whatever, and that just kind of totally doesn't throws the experience off, and removes from the research this authentic reaction to the product that we're trying to get some feedback on it. So that kind of hampers it in some sense when you have this static data that looks nothing like what they'd ever see.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point too, because sometimes the more realistic you make your prototype, it's you're upping the expectation levels too. So if something everything looks real except for the fact that you have to listen to music that I don't want to listen to, then it kind of pulls you even further. That is, it's this kind of moment where you're just kind of pulled out of the illusion. Versus if it was lower fidelity, you might be okay, it's whatever. But yeah.
Do you guys work at all with motion designers putting motion into your prototype?
We don't specifically. We really don't specifically, but I would love to. I just don't. We don't really. We have some people who do motion design, but I don't know that we have anyone who's really just a dedicated motion designer. But yeah, we would love to work with them, and we do work with people who have kind of like those motion design talents, but we haven't really ever worked with a dedicated motion designer that I know of.
So you mentioned something in there about teaching all designers to fish. Would the ultimate goal for a prototyping be to do that, to get them to fish? Or is there like this space where there is a place for a dedicated prototyper and somebody that has like a more advanced knowledge of this?
Yeah, definitely. So we are right now, that's kind of our team's like mission. And so we are pretty split between those two sort of worlds. And there are some times when we are almost all in one world, and then other times when we're almost all in the other world. So I think most companies who have prototypers are that, especially like the ones we met with. I know like, Netflix is like this, where I think they're a lot less concerned with like helping other like designers do prototypes and more about, it's like they're the prototyper, they're going to build this thing. And so, yeah, so there is that world for sure. There's that world. I mean, I think that world's probably more common than kind of what we're trying to do.
I think like this is a very different situation at a large company like Facebook. When I was back at a startup, it was like, you had to do everything, right? So as the designer, prototyper, whatever, it was like on me to be like the visual expert, the marketing expert, the technical expert, like implement the website. Like I had like this laundry list of things that I had to like be good at. And I actually found that to be like pretty stressful. So one of the things that I really enjoy, and again, like I'll quantify this by saying like, this is one of the blessings of being at like a larger, organization that can support, specialties, is like we have product designers who are really, really excellent with visual design, right? They can key in on like the real fine details, and they can tell you exactly like what would make something look beautiful and what will make something look like, I just built it yesterday, whatever. And I think like one of the things that I really enjoy about that relationship with a product designer is like, that's where I think the partnership thrives the best, is when like, and I think this killed me in interviews actually for a long time, so I stopped saying it eventually, but I would admit like during an interview when they'd say like, what are you working on as a designer or whatever, I'd be like, well, visually I'm not the strongest. And I think like that killed me. But we have something as a prototyper, which is like a level of technical expertise that we can add to the conversation. And I think that pairs actually very nicely with somebody who's got like a visual or aesthetic sense, or somebody who's a really great critical product thinker, or somebody who's got like this specialty with motion design, for example, right? Where they really are an expert on how these things move and relate to each other. And like, I love that pairing. And when I get to make those partnerships, I think like that works the best. So I'm not like of the mindset that like we need to convert everybody to like an expert prototyper. Would I love for them to have some like understanding of our process and what that looks like and the tools that we use? Of course. But I think like, especially when we can merge those skill sets, like that's where we can really like lift each other up. That's the part I love most about kind of it, not being good at some things when it comes to, visual design. Cool, let's see. Spotify bases a lot of your products around kind of being more universal. Have you created prototypes that interface with other production or prototype products? If so, what are some of the challenges of working between products from scratch?
Well, I would ask for clarity on that, but it's kind of a third hint. So, I mean, Steve, can you help me out with this question?
Yeah,
what
I think maybe it's asking something like, if you're thinking about like building, like Spotify works with a lot of other products, right? Like you integrate with a lot of different other things. Have you had a chance to work on anything that kind of does that? And like, where were some of the challenges, if so?
So like in different, like, well, we've done voice. Yeah, we've done some voice stuff for like smart speakers, if that's what we're talking about. Or like we've done some prototypes that like connect between different, like, you can be listening on your desktop versus, and controlling things on your mobile phone. So we have done a little bit of work there. I would love to do a lot more of that kind of, out there prototyping for like, even, I don't know where AR, VR, where we could do that with Spotify, but like, maybe there's something there, or like, wearables, or just, more voice stuff, or, things that are kind of a little bit, outside of the desktop kind of computer world. But yeah, so I guess we've done a little bit of that. I don't know if that answers.
No, I mean, I think that's like, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think like that's a challenging part of prototyping is like, you know, navigating between those new mediums. What about like, if there's a question on here, as someone new to the UX space, how can I get started with prototyping and building my skills?
Cool. I'll take a quick stab, and then Steve, I'm sure you have some ideas for that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. For me, it was about learning the basics. I mean, things are kind of so different now, honestly. Like, I think, you know, a tool like a Framer, it might be a good start, because it's pretty visual, and you could actually do a lot of design in that. But under the hood, there's a lot of React, so you can, like, if you kind of learned that, like, you can. It might be, I know a lot of people who kind of have learned to React through Framer, so that might be a good place to start. For me, just learning the very basics of like kind of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that was kind of how I started, and then just kind of tried to learn whatever I could from there. So that, yeah, that would be my short answer, I guess.
I guess my tip here would be like, and this probably expands like far beyond just prototyping skills and different tools that we would use. But I would say like, you need a buddy. Like, you need to buddy up with somebody who's like a really good or expert level person in this space, and not to like bother them every day or lean on them so hard that you like take up, that it's like annoying. But I think like in any time when I think about how I've like really like up leveled my own skill set or like learned something new, it's because I've had like that like engineering partner or that guy that I could go to and just say like, you know, I've gotten myself this far, I'm totally stuck. How do I fix it? And like, sometimes the answer is like super simple for them. And it's like, oh, you just change this one thing. And it's like, okay, that gets me unstuck. But that stops me from like spinning my wheels for like so long, when all that we really need is like just like that one person to bounce an idea off of. So like, work through your network, or maybe there's a guy that you work with or a girl that you work with or somebody that you know or somebody that you worked with previously who could basically help get you unstuck. And I think like that's definitely like a valuable part in like getting going when you're learning any new tool, but especially when it comes to something that has like a level of technical expertise that makes it difficult.
That's a great answer.
My toddler piped down so I can finally unmute, and I love this question. So I'll jump into my advice for somebody new getting started would be just there are a lot of tools out there. There's Framer, Principle, and probably a half dozen others that I won't be able to remember off the top of my head. And so I think the important thing when you're first getting starting out is not get overwhelmed with like trying to figure out the perfect thing or figure out all of that things. Like, just find one that looks like it might be fun to work with and just get started and try it. It's like at the nature of what we do as prototypers is like try things. It can be dirty, it can be messy. And then, you know, plus one onto Steve's comment of like reaching out to a buddy to ask for a question. I think there was like 70 people on this call that might be potential people for you to like tap if you do need some help. And that's kind of is one of the motivations for putting this together, is to build that network for people to kind of build their skills to meet more people and stuff like that. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on the question.
Great answer, JC.
I'll throw one out there. CodePen, if you're into like HTML, JavaScript, CSS prototyping, I've spent like CodePen holes where I just get like sucked into like browsing that site, because there's lots of like great, like, and they're tiny and bite sized. So I think that's what makes it good for learning, is you can see the JavaScript, you can see the CSS, you can see the HTML. It's all very, it's simple. It's constrained into like this focused thing that the CodePen is trying to show you. And there's some really cool like motion design and CSS animation examples that you can find and learn web prototyping by just browsing and copying. It's really easy to just fork somebody else's experiment and then start hacking at it.
That's an awesome tool. I've like definitely also gone down that hole sometimes where I start playing with one of them. I just wanted to be mindful of time, and it looks like we're pretty much right at up to the 11 o'clock mark here. I just wanted to say that first of all, thanks for coming. We definitely, I think, have a lot of interest, and I think we can build off of this. I didn't get a chance, or we didn't get a chance, I guess, to answer all the questions here, Doug. So we can maybe move some of them over to our to like the LinkedIn group, for example. That might be a great place to like have a discussion about some of these and like take that a little bit further, because I think we can share links that way. We can, kind of meet each other a little bit more. If you're on the call still, I'll follow up to this email with the recorded version, or I'll follow up to this with the recorded version via email. So you can either share that out to your networks, or, rewatch it if you have any questions about it later, or you want to kind of, just recap what we covered here today. I'll also send out an invite or a link to that LinkedIn group that I just mentioned, so that if you want to join us on there, I think like that's where we've kind of decided, at least for now, to kind of congregate as a community and start to build some more of that. So feel free to join us and participate in those discussions there. And then hopefully we can do this again and hear from one of you and your teams, and learn about how things look a little bit different from what we've seen at Spotify. So again, I want to thank you guys for coming. Doug, I want to thank you for taking the time to prepare for this. I know that it's been kind of crazy, like adjusting for, the new climate and all that stuff. And you put in a work in that presentation, and even hand drew some illustrations and stuff. So awesome, man. And, I think it was great to hear from you, man.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for everything you've done, and for having me here.
All right, cool guys. Well, have a great day, and I'll follow up shortly with you all.
Bye, everyone.